statement that I'm going to make, and then I'm going to yield the chair to our Mayor Pro Tem, Johnny Simpson. So if you bear with me, my comments may take a little bit. As we consider this item, as this item will be considered in a moment, the people that have orchestrated this recall call themselves, quote, the Citizens for Responsible Government. They want you to believe that they are government watchdogs, and to be sure they are watchdogs, but they're watchdogs for what the citizens of Dickinson know is the good old boy system. This recall isn't really about any of the manufactured controversies we've seen in the dozens of smear videos and angry public comments. This recall is about the fact that there's a long-term ruling class of people in this city that are out of power, and worse, this administration has acted to expose those that have profited and benefited from the system for decades. Consider the silence of the Citizens for Responsible Government concerning the major news of a felony indictment that came out of a Galveston County grand jury this past Thursday. This indictment only moved forward because I and some of the council members being attacked by this group acted almost 2 years ago to expose a cover-up carried out by former Police Chief Ron Morales and former Police Lieutenant Frank Price. This recall is about the fact that I and others dared to stand up to Ron Morales and expose a cover-up perpetrated by a man who built a career and a brand on the good old boy system here in Dickinson. Now, for those of you that are unaware of what I'm referring to, let me bring you up to speed and explain why the nature of this controversy lies at the heart of the recall effort. In 2022, the city manager and I were made aware of complaints about the arrest and injuries sustained during arrest of a local resident, Mr. Michael Spurlock. When citizens began alleging this was an incident of police brutality, I asked the city manager to look into the issue further. He in turn reached out to our former police chief, Ron Morales. Chief Morales told the city manager and myself that the injuries Mr. Spurlock sustained were due to being struck by a vehicle. We accepted this explanation and believed that it would be properly investigated by Lieutenant Frank Price, who was over internal affairs. The internal affairs investigation ultimately concluded that there was no wrongdoing on the part of the officer. Later, an officer stepped forward as a whistleblower to say that they felt this incident had been covered up and that further investigation was needed. At this point, council members Jenna Simpson, Johnny Simpson, Fred Linton, Jesse Brantley, and I were on council. When this incident occurred, we listened and called for a thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding the arrest of Michael Spurlock. The investigator's report was very different from the internal affairs report put together by Lieutenant Price. It concluded there were in fact major legal issues with the arrest, the detainment, and the injuries suffered by Michael Spurlock. It recommended that this incident be forwarded to the district attorney's office. Council ultimately followed this recommendation and forwarded all the evidence in a criminal complaint. The independent report also reached several conclusions about the investigation performed by Lieutenant Price and overseen by Chief Morales. It notes several problems with that investigation. For instance, Lieutenant Price interviewed only one witness for his internal affairs investigation, the officer subject of the investigation. This would be akin to only interviewing the suspect when investigating a murder. Other witnesses, including responding officers, were not interviewed as part of the internal investigation. Lieutenant Price's investigation concluded that it was unfounded to state that Mr. Spurlock's injuries were the result of the actions of an officer that threw him to a curb to where, in the words of a fellow officer, it, quote, sounded like a watermelon struck the curb. If the IA investigation is to be believed, Mr. Spurlock's injuries were the result of the reason for police being called out in the first place, to respond to a traffic accident in which Mr. Spurlock was the victim. A traffic accident so minor that Mr. Spurlock is on video, alert, mobile, and making jokes prior to the takedown. I want you to think about the conclusion of this report for just a moment. That conclusion isn't speaking to whether or not a use of force was justified. Indeed, there are cases where justified use of force can cause injury, but the IA investigation actually makes the outrageous claim that Mr. Spurlock's injuries were not caused by an officer takedown that knocked him unconscious and left him bleeding. A conclusion that outrageous cannot be reached based on pure incompetence, but rather actual malice. And that is precisely the conclusion that the independent report reached, that this report had to be tailored to reach that specific conclusion in order to back up the lie that Chief Morales told me about Mr. Spurlock's injuries being due to the traffic accident. Despite recall advocates, most notably Ms. Dawn King, branding this entire affair a distraction or retaliation, a grand jury felt differently and issued a felony indictment over this incident last week, an incident that Chief Morales and Lieutenant Price signed off as, quote, nothing to see. If not for the integrity of a department whistleblower and the integrity of officers that cooperated with the investigation, none of this would have come to light. Whatever the final outcome of this case is in terms of legal guilt or innocence of the officer, the plain fact is there was a cover-up, pure and simple. Hours of footage from the jail, footage that showed Mr. Scurlock crying out in pain, vomiting blood, was deleted despite being relevant to an IA investigation and had to be recovered by the city IT staff. Because you see, Chief Morales had a reputation, a brand to maintain, and instead of telling the truth, he and Lieutenant Price conducted a sham investigation to sweep all of this under the rug. Lieutenant Price never spoke to counsel's private investigator. He suddenly went on medical leave from which he never returned. I've read the transcript of Chief Morales' interview with the investigator. The chief was combative and initially refused to cooperate. Ultimately, the city attorney had to inform him that he was legally required to cooperate with the investigation. It's also worth noting that Chief Morales filed his retirement papers right around the time this investigation began. What I've laid out over the last few minutes is disturbing enough, but the truth is that Chief Morales' effort to cover up what happened to Michael Scurlock went beyond what I just described. In addition to burying this incident within the department, Chief Morales attempted to blackmail the city council in order to stop council from engaging in our lawful oversight and authority over the department. In the summer of 2022, council became suspicious about this incident, as well as other investigations into local corruption that appear to be buried by Lieutenant Price. Chief Morales accessed security camera recordings in City Hall and pulled up recordings from a camera that faces the door of the mayor's office. Chief Morales confronted the city manager and claimed that a quorum of council had gathered in my office prior to a council meeting. Chief Morales was then advised by the city manager, the city attorney, as well as an outside attorney, that a quorum was not present, that city business was not deliberated, and that no violation of state law had occurred. Chief Morales' comment to the city manager was akin to that it would, quote, be a shame if word of this supposed illegal meeting got out. The private investigator, while also participating in the Uvalde police response investigation, informed the city manager that colleagues in law enforcement and the Uvalde case specifically had warned him that Chief Morales was calling them to ask about the investigator's background in what seemed to be an attempt to gather information that could discredit council's investigator. You need to leave the room, sir. Sir, leave the room. You cannot interrupt. We do not interrupt you.
Did we have a motion?
You told me many times that my 3 minutes were up.
Discussion.
You're disrupting the meeting. Please leave.
Keep going, I'm coming back.
We began, let me start that section over. The private investigator, while also participating in the Uvalde police response investigation, informed the city manager that colleagues in law enforcement in the Uvalde case specifically had warned him that Chief Morales was calling them to ask about the investigator's background in what seemed to be an attempt to gather information that could discredit council's investigator. We began receiving public information requests from Mr. Wayne Dolcefino asking for a copy of a security camera footage of this supposed illegal meeting. Around the same time, Mr. Dolcefino also reached out to our private investigator. The investigator had been present for this meeting in my office, and Mr. Dolcefino claimed that an illegal meeting took place and asked the investigator to work with him to, quote, take them down together. Our investigator declined and informed him that nothing illegal had happened during the meeting. Ultimately, Mr. Dolcefino received this footage kept by Chief Morales that he recorded with a cell phone off his monitor to avoid leaving a log of him downloading this footage. It's interesting that jail footage of Mr. Scurlock suffering in jail was deleted, but we managed to retain a copy of this blackmail footage. As Mr. Dolcefino has stated, he doesn't work for free, and despite being a strong advocate for transparency, he won't disclose who funds his work. But it's an open secret in town that a longtime friend and political ally of Chief Morales, Joe Wilburn, is more than likely funding the smear campaign. The Scurlock investigation was referred to the district attorney's office in the spring of 2023, but it didn't become public knowledge until the fall of 2023. Only weeks after, myself and other members of council confirmed to the press that an investigation had occurred and that we felt the former police administration attempted to bury the Scurlock investigation, smear mailers calling for my recall went out and a campaign began. Decide for yourself if that's a coincidence. On social media, advocates of the recall claimed I was a traitor and a terrorist and said I should be hanged. Mr. Joe Wilburn, despite his comments this evening, talked with a friend about how city council should, quote, be purged from the earth, and discussed openly how to dispose of bodies. All of this, everything, this recall, this violent rhetoric, stalking city officials across state lines, blackmail of city council, is because your government is working to benefit the many and not just the few. The recall committee that has been put together is perhaps the best representation of the good old boy system we could put together in Dickinson. We have 3 former members of council with strong ties to this regime, spearheading the effort. They want so desperately for Dickinson to get back to business as usual. They represent a way of doing business that has to end. They represent the system that puts someone like Ron Morales in charge of our police department in the first place. Over 25 years ago, that mentality took him, Dickinson's mayor, and the powers that be appointed him to police chief. He had almost no experience as a police officer, reportedly had to attend the police academy prior to assuming the role of chief, and lacked a bachelor's degree as required by state law. None of this was enough to stop his appointment. He went from cadet to police chief because he was one of the boys, one of the good old boys. All of this behavior has continued, and many expect to continue to get their piece of the pie. Some are in this room, and some are sitting up at the dais with us right now. Mr. Wilburn attempted to interfere with the Water Street deal years ago and threatened a developer to give his friend a sweetheart land deal or risk having him blow up the development. It only stopped because the city manager and I stepped in. Mr. Wilburn then hired Mr. Dolcefino to smear and discredit us. When Councilman Schick was president of the EDC, he flaunted the spirit, if not the letter, of state nepotism laws when he emailed the EDC director and directed him to purchase thousands of dollars of furniture for his girlfriend, now his wife, for her new job that she would be starting full-time. He did this despite there being no authorization from the EDC board for this hire. This nepotism only stopped because the city manager and I stepped in. Now, the same person, proudly endorsed by the former chief and backed by Mr. Wilburn, is the primary advocate on council, asking for it to vote to violate the charter and move the recall forward. This fight of this recall isn't a fight between young and old or a fight between those that have lived here for generations. Not everyone that came before was corrupt. God knows I'm not Dickinson's savior, and I'm not the first or only person to try to fight back against the system in this community, either as a member of the community or member of city council. But I've become, though, as a target of those that are afraid power and influence is slipping away. You know, when you were kids, there was this chant kids would say to each other. You probably heard it before. I'm rubber, you're glue. Everything you say bounces off to me and sticks back to you. Folks, that's what this recall is really about. It's about an administration that after many years is working to root out actual corruption, and the ones doing this dirt are deflecting by accusing us of the very things that they're guilty of. That isn't fair to us, but that isn't the real injustice. It isn't fair to you, the people, and more importantly, it isn't fair to people like Michael Spurlock. So Dickinson, you do have a choice. You can choose to give in to bullying, threats, smear. You can choose to go back to the past where jobs and deals are handed out based on who you know, where injustices are swept under the rug. Or you can choose to support leadership that stood up and is working to make Dickinson a place where your city works for everyone. You can choose to listen to the supposed Citizens for Responsible Government, a group whose response to elected officials standing up to expose cover-ups is to recall them. The choice is yours. And with that, I yield the floor to Mayor Pro Tem Simpson.